When a devastating spring storm traps a high-powered CEO in her crushed luxury sedan, the only thing standing between her and the rising floodwaters is a scarred veteran fighting for his own redemption. The windshield wipers of Elias's battered 2014 Ford F-150 fought a losing battle against the torrential downpour, squealing in protest as sheets of freezing rain slammed against the glass. It was late April 2026, a time when the world was supposed to be thawing into the gentle warmth of spring, but nature, much like the brutal economic landscape outside the truck's cab, was stubbornly unforgiving. The sky hung low and heavy, bruised with the charcoal and violet hues of a freak late-season storm that had already paralyzed half the city. Inside the cold cab, Elias gripped the cracked leather steering wheel with calloused hands, his knuckles white from the tension. The rhythmic thwack-thwack of the wipers was the only sound competing with the roar of the wind and the anxious loop of his own thoughts. He was a veteran of foreign conflicts, a man who had survived the chaotic violence of the battlefield, but navigating the silent, crushing warfare of single fatherhood in a broken economy was an entirely different kind of trench. Every dollar was a casualty, every bill a new front line. He thought of his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, asleep at home under the watchful eye of a neighbor he couldn't really afford to pay. He had taken this grueling overnight warehouse shift just to keep the lights on and the predatory collection agencies at bay. Exhaustion pulled at the corners of his eyes, an invisible weight dragging him toward despair, but the primal need to protect and provide for his little girl kept his foot steady on the accelerator. He was just trying to survive the drive home. He was just trying to make it to sunrise. The highway ahead was a treacherous ribbon of black ice and pooling water, reflecting the bleeding red halos of taillights in the gloom. Traffic was sparse, mostly desperate commuters like him, or the automated delivery drones that didn't know the meaning of bad weather. Then, cutting through the heavy curtain of rain, a sleek, iridescent silver shape blurred past him in the fast lane. It was a 2026 model autonomous luxury sedan, a multi-million-dollar cocoon of polished titanium and smart glass, completely out of place in this decaying industrial corridor. Elias watched it with a detached, weary cynicism, a symbol of the upper echelon corporate world that floated comfortably above the drowning working class. But technology, no matter how advanced, was no match for the raw, unbridled fury of a flooded interstate. As the luxury vehicle hit a massive, surging pool of water accumulating near a blocked storm drain, its sophisticated sensors failed to compensate for the sudden, absolute loss of friction. In a horrifying display of physics, the heavy sedan violently hydroplaned. It snapped sideways, spinning like a top across 3 lanes of slick asphalt before slamming with a sickening metallic crunch into the reinforced concrete median. The impact was catastrophic. The front end crumpled inward, the reinforced smart glass shattered into thousands of opaque webs, and the vehicle spun a final time before wedging itself tightly between the concrete barrier and the sloping embankment, right in the lowest point of the highway, where the floodwaters were aggressively rising. Elias slammed on his brakes, his heavy truck fishtailing wildly before he managed to muscle it onto the muddy shoulder, his headlights piercing the deluge to illuminate the wreckage. A dark, muddy torrent of water was already rushing down the embankment, surging against the crushed doors of the luxury sedan, rising past the wheel wells with terrifying speed. For a fraction of a second, the overwhelming urge of self-preservation screamed at him to stay in the warm, dry cab. The world was dangerous enough, and he had a daughter who desperately needed him alive. But as the floodwaters crept higher up the windows, threatening to entomb whoever was trapped inside, an ancient, deeply ingrained switch flipped inside his mind. The weary, beaten-down warehouse worker vanished instantly, replaced by the highly trained combat medic who had pulled wounded men from burning wreckage years ago. Adrenaline, sharp and electric, flooded his system, banishing the fatigue from his bones. He didn't hesitate, he just moved.
Elias reached behind his seat, his hand closing around the heavy, cold steel of a heavy-duty crowbar he kept for emergencies. He kicked his door open, stepping out into the howling gale. The freezing rain hit him like a barrage of needles, soaking through his thin canvas jacket in seconds, but he barely felt the cold. The wind roared in his ears, a chaotic symphony of destruction, as he sprinted down the slick, treacherous incline toward the rising deluge. The water was waist-deep and freezing by the time he reached the crushed sedan, fighting the aggressive current that threatened to sweep his legs out from under him. He waded into the vortex of the storm, gripping his crowbar, ready to wage war against the wreckage.
The freezing deluge gnawed at Elias's legs like a vise of solid ice as he fought his way through the surging floodwaters toward the mangled sedan. The muddy current dragged at his soaked jeans, threatening to pull him under the murky surface, but his combat boots found purchase on the submerged debris littering the highway shoulder. Up close, the multi-million-dollar vehicle was a tragic monument to the storm's fury. The sleek titanium chassis was folded inward like crushed foil, and the smart glass windows, designed to withstand ballistic impacts, were spiderwebbed with thousands of opaque fractures. The car's sophisticated electrical systems had completely shorted out, leaving the interior pitch black, save for the eerie, intermittent flashing of a dying interior emergency light. Inside the sinking tomb, the water level was rising with terrifying speed, already cresting the leather dashboard. Through a small, relatively clear patch of the shattered window, Elias could see the frantic silhouette of the driver. It was a woman, her hands beating desperately against the immovable glass, her mouth open in a soundless scream that was entirely swallowed by the howling wind. She was trapped in a high-tech vault that had suddenly become her watery coffin, the water pressing against the doors making it impossible for her to push them open from the inside. Bracing himself against the side of the submerged vehicle, Elias jammed the wedged end of his heavy steel crowbar into the microscopic seam of the warped driver's side door. The metal screamed in protest, a shrill grinding noise that cut through the roar of the tempest as he threw his entire body weight into the lever. His muscles, burning with exhaustion and the freezing cold, strained to their absolute limit. Every agonizing inch of progress was a battle against the crushing pressure of the rising water outside and the structural integrity of the reinforced frame. Inside, Elena, a woman who commanded international boardrooms and wielded billions with a single signature, felt the icy water rising past her chest, paralyzing her lungs. For the first time in her meticulously curated life, her immense wealth, her status, and her power were utterly meaningless. She couldn't negotiate with the rising tide. She couldn't buy her way out of the crushed metal. As the doorframe finally began to buckle and tear under Elias's relentless assault, a large chunk of the shattered smart glass gave way, falling inward. In that jagged, gaping opening, their eyes locked. Elias saw the stark, unfiltered terror of a human being realizing their own mortality, while Elena saw a muddy, scarred stranger risking his life for someone he didn't even know. In that raw, suspended fraction of a second, the impenetrable armor of her corporate persona completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but pure, desperate vulnerability. "Grab my hand," Elias roared over the deafening gale, his voice rough and commanding, leaving no room for panic. He reached his thick, calloused arm through the jagged metallic maw, ignoring the sharp edges that sliced into the fabric of his jacket and bit into his skin. Elena lunged forward, coughing on the dirty floodwater, and clamped her freezing, trembling fingers around his solid forearm with a grip fueled by pure survival instinct. With a guttural shout, Elias planted his feet against the sinking chassis and pulled backward with all his remaining strength. He hauled her shivering frame out of the submerged cabin just as another violent surge of water flooded the interior completely. The storm immediately assaulted her, the driving rain blinding her as the freezing wind stole the breath from her lungs. But Elias didn't give her a chance to falter. He wrapped a strong, protective arm around her waist, acting as a human shield against the brutal elements, and practically carried her through the rushing current up the slippery embankment. Every step was a treacherous struggle against the mud and the gale, but the veteran's focus never wavered. He hauled her over the concrete barrier and dragged her toward the idling warmth of his battered Ford F-150. Yanking the heavy passenger door open, he lifted her into the cab, slamming the door shut against the howling tempest. The sudden silence inside the truck, broken only by the hum of the heater and their ragged, gasping breaths, marked the end of the violent extraction, and the quiet beginning of an unexpected sanctuary. The heavy steel door of the Ford F-150 slammed shut, instantly severing the deafening roar of the tempest outside and sealing them within a small, dimly lit sanctuary of humming warmth. Elena collapsed against the worn, frayed fabric of the passenger seat, her entire body violently trembling as the adrenaline that had fueled her survival began to rapidly ebb, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep cold that seemed to settle directly into her marrow. Beside her, Elias moved with a quiet, methodical efficiency that stood in stark contrast to the chaotic violence of the flooded highway they had just escaped. He reached behind the bench seat, pulling out a thick, faded military-issue wool blanket, and carefully draped it over her shivering shoulders before unscrewing the cap of a battered steel thermos and pouring a steaming cup of bitter black coffee. As he extended his hand to offer her the makeshift cup, the dim amber glow of the dashboard instrument panel illuminated a jagged, brutal network of raised white shrapnel scars, tearing a devastating path up his thick forearm, disappearing beneath the soaked, muddy sleeve of his canvas jacket. Elena's gaze caught on the mutilated flesh, the raw, undeniable visual evidence of a life lived far outside the sterile, polished walls of her elite corporate skyscrapers. Sensing her eyes lingering on his arm, Elias didn't flinch or pull away in shame. Instead, his voice, gravelly and low, broke the heavy, insulated silence, carrying the weary, profound weight of a man who had fought entirely too many wars. He spoke quietly of the blistering foreign deserts and the deafening, earth-shattering explosions that had abruptly ended his final combat deployment. But more agonizingly, he detailed the silent, crushing ambush of returning home to a ruthless 2026 society that had eagerly thanked him for his service before immediately discarding him. He shared the suffocating daily struggle of post-war reintegration, the long, sleepless nights spent wrestling with the ghosts of phantom gunfire, and the demoralizing uphill battle to carve out a meager, honest survival for his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, in a hyperinflated economy purposefully designed to grind the working class into dust. Listening to the steady, unpretentious cadence of his voice while the rain lashed fiercely against the windshield, Elena felt an unfamiliar, painful knot tighten in her throat, rapidly dissolving the last remaining barriers of her carefully constructed, ruthless executive defenses. Clutching the warm cup desperately between her freezing, pale hands, she found herself offering a raw confession she had never dared to voice aloud, not to her sycophantic board of directors, not to her elite high society peers, and rarely even to her own reflection in the mirror. She spoke of the hollow, echoing emptiness of her own staggering success, bitterly acknowledging the billions in her offshore accounts that had just proven utterly useless against a rising tide of dirty, muddy water. She laid bare the profound, suffocating isolation that accompanied her high-stakes, cutthroat lifestyle, a glittering, superficial world where every human interaction was a calculated transaction, every smile harbored a hidden agenda, and her fundamental worth was entirely measured by quarterly profit margins and aggressive hostile takeovers. In the quiet, enforced intimacy of the battered truck cab, stripped of her designer suits, her limitless credit cards, and her untouchable authority, Elena realized she was fundamentally poorer in spirit than the struggling, scarred warehouse worker sitting beside her. As she watched Elias calmly adjust the analog dials of the emergency radio to monitor the storm's shifting trajectory, methodically checking the weather band while ensuring the ancient heater vents were pointed directly at her freezing feet, a profound, irreversible paradigm shift took root deep within her mind. His deeply ingrained protective nature, undeniably born of severe trauma but selflessly weaponized for salvation, acted as a powerful catalyst, illuminating a starkly different, deeply grounded version of strength and purpose than anything she had ever known or valued.
True power, she realized with striking, life-altering clarity as the storm raged impotently against the glass, wasn't the ability to ruthlessly dismantle a competing global corporation or manipulate volatile financial markets from a penthouse suite. It was the quiet, steadfast resolve to plunge into freezing floodwaters, to pull a stranger from a sinking metal tomb, to offer a scarred, steady hand in the absolute darkest of storms, and to shield the vulnerable from a chaotic world that so often refused to care.
The relentless fury of the spring storm finally began to exhaust itself as the deepest, darkest hours of the night slowly surrendered to the bruised, violet hues of an approaching dawn. The deafening roar of the tempest gradually downshifted into a steady, rhythmic drizzle, and the thick, suffocating curtain of clouds began to fracture, allowing the first fragile, pale streaks of morning light to bleed across the devastated landscape of the flooded highway. Piercing through the misty gloom, the harsh, staccato flashes of red and blue emergency lights signaled the long-awaited arrival of the first responders, their sirens wailing like mechanical banshees as a fleet of ambulances, heavy-duty rescue engines, and police cruisers carefully navigated the treacherous, debris-strewn asphalt. As Elias stepped out of the warm sanctuary of his idling Ford truck to flag down the approaching paramedics, the rising sun brutally illuminated the sheer magnitude of the physical destruction left in the wake of the tempest. The multi-million-dollar autonomous luxury sedan he had forcefully pried open hours earlier was now nothing more than a mangled, submerged hunk of twisted titanium and shattered smart glass, half buried in a receding tide of thick, churning mud and tangled branches. Watching the highly trained emergency medical technicians rush forward with their stretchers, thermal blankets, and heavy trauma kits to gently extract Elena from the passenger seat of his truck, Elias felt a profound tectonic shift occurring deep within the heavily guarded walls of his own chest. For years since his final deployment, the razor-sharp combat instincts, the hypervigilance, and the split-second survival reactions programmed into his very nervous system had felt like a suffocating curse, a lingering radioactive poison that isolated him from normal civilian life and haunted his darkest, most vulnerable nightmares with the relentless echoes of warfare. But standing there in the cold, biting morning air, watching the woman breathe, shiver, and speak to the paramedics solely because of those exact, deeply ingrained reflexes, the agonizing burden of his violent history suddenly fractured, revealing a brilliant, undeniable core of profound purpose. He realized with startling, overwhelming clarity that his unique, hard-won skill set was not a broken anomaly to be hidden away in shame, nor a symptom of a damaged mind, but rather a vital, incredibly potent gift, a fierce, unyielding protective shield that had not only saved a helpless stranger's life, but would forever ensure his daughter, Lily, would always have a father capable of weathering any catastrophic storm the brutal, unpredictable 2026 world could possibly throw at her. The heavy, invisible armor of guilt and inadequacy he had worn since returning home finally cracked and fell away, replaced by a deep, quiet pride that anchored his weary soul and finally silenced the echoing, phantom gunfire of his past. Before the paramedics could completely secure her onto the waiting gurney to transport her to the nearest elite medical facility for comprehensive observation and treatment, Elena gently but firmly pushed past the bewildered emergency workers, pulling a damp, crumpled piece of heavy cardstock and a pen from the ruined pocket of her designer jacket. She walked slowly back to the battered, mud-splattered truck, her movements stiff, aching, and visibly exhausted, yet undeniably imbued with a newfound, profound humility that completely erased the intimidating, untouchable aura of her previous high-stakes corporate existence. She didn't hand him a glossy, gold-embossed business card or offer a hollow, legally vetted promise of financial compensation for his heroic, life-saving efforts. Instead, she pressed a simple, torn piece of waterlogged paper containing a hurriedly scrawled private telephone number directly into his calloused, deeply scarred, and muddy palm.
Her eyes, no longer reflecting the cold, calculating detachment of a billionaire chief executive officer evaluating a business transaction, met his tired gaze with a warm, unwavering sincerity that communicated volumes more than any spoken words ever could. It was an unspoken, solemn pact forged in the terrifying crucible of a flooded, ruined highway, a genuine ironclad promise to permanently bridge the vast, seemingly insurmountable economic and social divides that separated their two vastly different worlds, ensuring that the miraculous, deeply redemptive human connection they had sparked in the absolute darkest hour of the storm would never be washed away by the harsh, revealing light of day.
The exhausted, battered engine of the 2014 Ford F-150 finally sputtered into the cramped, oil-stained parking lot of Elias's modest apartment complex just as the morning sun fully broke through the dissipating clouds, casting a warm, brilliant golden light over a city slowly waking up to the chaotic aftermath of the devastating spring storm. Walking up the cracked concrete stairs to his second-floor unit, Elias's legs felt like heavy lead, his muscles screaming in delayed, burning agony from the brutal physical exertion of the highway rescue. Yet his weary spirit felt impossibly light, completely unburdened by the crushing, invisible weight of trauma and guilt he had silently carried for so many years. As he quietly unlocked the thin wooden door and stepped into the small, dimly lit living room, his 7-year-old daughter, Lily, bounded off the faded sofa where she had been waiting with their neighbor, her sleepy eyes widening with pure joy as she sprinted across the worn carpet to throw her small arms around his muddy, soaked legs. Dropping to his knees, despite the throbbing ache in his joints, Elias pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, burying his face in her unruly hair, and for the first time since returning from the brutal foreign battlefields, he didn't feel the suffocating panic of inadequacy or the creeping dread that he was a permanently broken man, fundamentally incapable of raising her. Instead, his heart was firmly anchored by a profound, radiant sense of internal peace and a newly discovered, unshakable pride in the strong, protective hands that held her safely against his chest. The deeply healing, transformative impact of that chaotic, rainy morning on the flooded interstate absolutely refused to remain contained within the modest walls of Elias's apartment, rapidly and forcefully echoing outwards to catalyze a massive, systemic paradigm shift across the highest, most untouchable and elite echelons of the 2026 corporate world. Elena, forever irrevocably changed down to her very soul by the scarred, selfless working-class veteran who had violently pried her from a sinking high-tech titanium tomb, returned to the sterile, glass-walled pinnacle of her billionaire corporate empire, not as a ruthless, calculating chief executive officer, but as a fiercely awakened human being driven by a radical, unprecedented vision of profound societal obligation. Refusing to allow their fleeting, miraculous highway connection to fade into a mere dinner party anecdote, she aggressively and ruthlessly restructured her entire global conglomerate, unilaterally redirecting an astronomical percentage of her corporate empire's vast, previously guarded financial resources to directly launch, fund, and permanently endow expansive nationwide veteran-led initiatives and comprehensive grassroots reintegration programs. Her staggering, incomprehensible wealth, once selfishly hoarded in untraceable offshore accounts and utilized strictly for aggressive hostile takeovers, was suddenly and powerfully transformed into a tangible, life-saving lifeline for thousands of struggling, forgotten veterans, providing them immediate, unhindered access to premium mental health care, affordable and safe housing, specialized career retraining, and vital, boots-on-the-ground community support systems expertly designed to heal the deep, invisible wounds of war that a hyper-capitalist society had so eagerly chosen to ignore. She didn't just write a hollow, legally vetted, tax-deductible charity check to temporarily appease her frantic public relations department. She actively hired Elias,
pulling him from the grueling midnight warehouse shifts to serve as the principal director of her primary philanthropic foundation, implicitly trusting the very same steady, capable hands that had valiantly saved her life to expertly guide and aggressively protect the massive systemic overhaul she was unleashing upon a fractured, deeply cynical society. Their terrifying, deeply intimate shared moment of absolute vulnerability amidst the shattered, submerged wreckage of a flooded highway had miraculously sparked a quiet but entirely unstoppable social revolution, acting as a brilliant, unyielding beacon of genuine hope, tearing through the gloomy, oppressive economic despair of the modern era to definitively prove that no amount of advanced autonomous technology or hoarded artificial wealth could ever possibly replicate or replace the raw, foundational power of authentic human compassion. As Elias stood proudly beside Elena several months later, officially cutting the bright ceremonial ribbon on a massive state-of-the-art, fully funded veteran housing and rehabilitation community, while holding his daughter Lily's tiny hand tightly in his own, the profound, unyielding truth of their extraordinary, life-altering encounter finally settled completely over them both. They had successfully proven to a hyper-individualistic, technologically obsessed world that even in the turbulent, unpredictable, and often ruthlessly unforgiving year of 2026, the absolute most enduring, powerful, and universally valuable currency humanity could ever hope to possess remains the selfless, unwavering reach of a quiet, protective hand, willingly extending into the absolute darkest of storms to save another.